Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land we are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As we come together to engage in a dialogue around literature and translation, we recognize that meaningful cultural exchange also means acknowledging and respecting the histories, communities, and ongoing presence of the indigenous peoples whose land makes this gathering possible. We encourage you to seek out resources to reflect on the land that you are on, your relationship with the land, and who the traditional keepers of the land are. We are grateful to work and gather here. We are joined today by four guest speakers. Let me briefly introduce them. Ted Goosen taught Japanese literature and film at York University in Toronto. He is co editor of Monkey, New Writing from Japan, and the general editor of the Oxford Book of Japanese Short Stories, and has published translations of many novel stories and essays by Japanese authors. Sonia Arntzen is Professor Emerita at the University of Toronto and focuses on the research and translation of pre-modern Japanese literature. She is currently working on a translation which will offer a new perspective on a classic of early Japanese fiction. Chris Corker is currently writing his doctoral thesis on apocalyptic nostalgia in Japanese literature and film at York University. Chris is also a long-standing member of the Monkey team. Meg Taylor, who is our moderator today, started her career as a book editor in Tokyo. In Canada, where she previously lived for many years, she worked as a nonfiction editor and served as an instructor and academic coordinator for the postgraduate publishing certificate program at TMU. She now focuses Japan related projects in the US and is the managing editor for Monkey. I look forward to hearing from all of the speakers here today. Now, to give a few opening remarks, let me invite our Executive Director, Ms. Noriko Yamamoto, to the podium. Thank you.
So good evening, everyone. I am Noriko Yamamoto, and it is my true pleasure to welcome you all to this evening special talk event. This afternoon, we announced that Japan Foundation Toronto will be making a few changes our operations toward the end of this year. Our office will be relocated to a different space, and our public facilities will face some challenges, including the closure of our public lending library and gallery. As we embark on this new chapter, our vision, mission, and passions remain unchanged. And we look to the future with optimism and immense gratitude and appreciation for the dedication and passions of everyone who had worked with us and shaped the history together. To give thanks to everyone, to reflect on our journey so far, and to share our vision for the future. We are putting together special events over the next few months. I'd like to extend an invitation to everyone here to join us for those events to celebrate the people and the achievement around us. As you know, JFD's mission for culture exchange and dialogues spans across our programs, and every year we partner with organizations and festivals to highlight Japanese authors and writers. Over the years, it has gone without notice that Japanese literature and voices are becoming increasingly popular among English readers. And many bookstores and libraries have dedicated Japanese literature section. At our author event, we have also noticed that audiences are not only interested in learning about the authors or their stories, but are also widely enthusiastic about the topic of translation. So, as we begin our celebratory event, looking ahead to JFT's new chapter today, we felt it was only appropriate to acknowledge and celebrate the efforts and creativity that goes into bringing Japanese voices to popularity by bringing translators of Japanese literature on stage. We are joined today by three Canada-based translators, Ted Gusen, Sonia Ansen, and Chris Coker, and the moderator for this event, Meg Taylor, who is an editor. All four our guest speakers have spent years working on bringing Japanese literature to the forefront in Canada and North America, and are also part of a project that has played a significant role in introducing Japanese voices to English readers, Monkey, New Writing from Japan. For those who not familiar, Monkey is a literary magazine that plays a dynamic role in bringing languages, cultures, and literary translations to bring Japanese literature to English readers. I'm very excited to hear more about Monkey and the vision behind it, along with the speaker's insights on creative process, the future, and opportunities of Japanese literature in translation today. Now, please join me in welcoming Meg to take over.
I've had the pleasure of working with Ted since the mid 90s. We organized a special issue of Descant magazine, a literary journal, special Japan issue in 94, maybe. I don't know. It was sometime in the mid 90s. It's so long ago. Yes, yes. And that was followed quickly by the Oxford Book of Japanese Short Stories, which we worked on together. Then I returned to the States in 2015. In 2020, in the first year of the pandemic, working with Gilbert Lee, who is here, our designer, our brilliant designer. We founded a Monkey New Writing from Japan and launched it in the very dark days of the pandemic. And that was an online launch, and about 400 people from around the world showed interest and attended that launch. It was really quite moving, to have people really from every continent except Africa. It was, we didn't have people from Africa, but otherwise, Australia, all through Asia, and Europe and North America and South America. We had people attending. Part of our mission is to work closely with translators and advocate for them. And this, we're going to get into the details of what that means. If we don't cover that, please ask questions in the Q&A. We would be delighted to talk about sharing royalties and that sort of thing. We are closely tied to the Tokyo-based Monkey Literary Journal, founded and edited by Motoyuki Shibata, who is the visionary behind all of this. And Ted will talk a little bit later about Monkey Business, about the very roots of what we're doing, which date back to 2011. We're going to start by just jumping into the process, what each of the translators go through. Sonia's going to start with a reading from Ochikubo Monogatari, which is kind of the Cinderella story of Japan. That's how I think about it. You talk about it that way too. So I'm going to turn it over to Sonia, and they're each going to do a reading, and then we'll talk much more generally about the state of translation, Japanese to English.
Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm speaking first, I think, because I'm the oldest. And I'm going to read from the oldest work of literature. So the enthusiasm for Japanese literature and translation right now is almost exclusively focused, I think, on modern literature. But there's a long tradition, so of literature in Japan, as you well know, and I'm working now on this translation of the Ochikubo Monogatari. My working title is Lady of the Low Chamber. It's not published yet. It's an anonymous early work of fiction from sometime before 980, which means before the Tale of Genji. Now the Tale of Genji, everybody knows. It has made it into world literature, but it's sort of the one title from pre-modern Japanese literature that's known almost by everybody. So this precedes that. The Tale of Genji changed everything, but this is one of the early stars of a really remarkable period of fiction writing in Japan 1,000 years ago. From the 10th basically to the 11th century, we know there were hundreds of tales produced, and almost none of them are extant. We have the titles and only just a handful of works that remain. And one reason was it was a popular literature, and nobody at the time thought it was important. It was just entertainment, mainly for women. And that also is so unusual in world literary history to have the production of fiction writing for women. Now, would you believe it? The main theme is romance. and, um, so the Lady of the Low Chamber belongs to a genre of fiction, which we know as the Cinderella story, the beautiful, virtuous woman who's persecuted by her stepmother and rescued by a nobleman. It was known in the Heian period as the wicked stepmother tale. So much more focused on the evils of the stepmother. However, when we think of Cinderella in English, we often think of a fairy tale, fairy godmothers, and so on. The Lady of the Low Chamber is firmly grounded in the nitty gritty of the social reality of the time. The other interesting aspect of it, I think, is that it is a near parody. It makes fun of the genre of the Cinderella story at the same time as telling a gripping story with interesting characters and witty dialogue that we enjoy. So it's not a complete send up, but it just exaggerates things enough with humor and, as I say, exaggeration. So I'm going to introduce the characters to you that are in the excerpt. The heroine is called Aya. Now, later on, there might be an opportunity to talk about this, but she doesn't have this name in the original. It's a name I gave her, but I call her Aya. And the hero is Michiori, and he is a scion of the most political or the most powerful political family at the time that the novel is set, which was contemporary with the people there. They would recognize who this kind of character was, the Fujiwara family. Aya has a servant named Akogi, and Akogi has been with her since childhood. But they were raised as children together, so they are about the same age, and they are good friends as well as being kind of lady, mistress, and servant. Michiori also has a male servant who was the son of his wet nurse. So again, they've known one another since childhood. And his name is Tachiwaki, literally means bodyguard. And Akogi and Tachiwaki are as important characters in this story as the hero and heroine themselves. In fact, they had become lovers before this story opened, so were regarded as married, and they are the go-betweens that bring the hero and the heroine together. So this episode takes place shortly after Aya and Michiori have become intimate. Michiori took the opportunity of the absence of the family on a pilgrimage to get into the household and sleep with Aya for 2 nights. This is the critical third night of their relationship. In the Heian period, people were considered married if they slept together for 3 nights consecutively. If they didn't sleep together for the third night, it wasn't a marriage. So it's a critical time, but it happens to be raining, and Michiori can't consider taking the ox carriage out to visit. And so Michiori and Tachiwaki have both sent letters of regret to their lovers saying, "We can't make it tonight." And Michiori has received a letter back from Aya that's forlorn. And Tachiwaki has received a letter back from Akogi that's a tongue lashing for not making it. So this is how the scene opens. And I'll read to you. Michiori read the message from Aya by lamplight and thought, how very sad she seems. Then he read Akogi's message to Tachiwaki and said, they do seem quite upset. After all, it's the third night. They must be thinking that this relationship is getting off to a bad start. What a shame. Since the rain was pouring down even harder now, Michiori, feeling miserable, sat down and rested his chin in his hand. There's nothing to be done, thought Tachiwaki. And then he let out a sigh and stood up. Michiori said, sit with me yet a while. And then, what? Are you actually thinking of going there? When Tachiwaki replied, I'll go on foot and see if I can say something to console them. Michiori announced, then we will go together. Tachiwaki was overjoyed. This is splendid, my lord. Michiori ordered him to fetch a large umbrella. I will be with you as soon as I change. He withdrew to his inner chamber while Tachiwaki went in search of an umbrella. Meanwhile, back at the residence, Akogi, having no idea that the men were about to set off, was feeling chagrined and spoke angrily. This is a merciless rain. Feeling embarrassed by her own anxiety, Aya said, why do you say that? Well, it could let up for a bit, couldn't it? It's just so terribly unfortunate. Aya recalled an old poem from the Issei stories, and she murmured it. With this and that, I can hardly ask outright whether you love me, and rain so plain with the truth now falls in a flood of tears. She spoke softly and felt immediately embarrassed, wondering what Akogi would think of her for revealing her feelings so openly. She lapsed into silence, leaning on the armrest. Another little break. Michiori, clad in a set of informal white garments over hunting breeches, stepped in behind Tachiwaki, sharing the same big umbrella. They looked for all the world like bearers of a portable shrine in a festival. They opened the gate quietly and slipped out. In the pitch dark, they staggered along the poor path, making their way with difficulty. Where the alley met a wider road, they caught sight of the advance guards of a large party approaching, lit by many torches. Since the alley where they were walking was very narrow, there was no place for them to hide. They pressed themselves against a wall and edged along, lowering their umbrella to hide their faces. Some lower-ranking guardsmen spotted them and called out, "Hey, let's stop and question those men. They look suspicious. Two men on their own should not be out in the middle of the night in a storm like this. Let's arrest them." Michiori and Tachiwaki stopped and stood there, quite downcast, while the men examined them by torchlight. "Look how white their legs are. They don't look like robbers." "Small-time thieves of the aristocratic variety might have white legs, you know," called out another man as he walked by. One of the interrogators demanded, "Why are you still standing? Sit down, both of you." With that, he tapped the umbrella smartly with his staff and forced them to sit down cross-legged in a particularly filthy part of the alley. Another officious man came up. Why are you cowering under that umbrella trying to hide your faces?" With that, he yanked the umbrella out of their hands and sent them sprawling in the dung. The first man blew on his torch to get more light. He exclaimed, "They're wearing good quality hunting breeches. They must just be low-ranking attendants in some noble household who've slipped out to visit their girls." The men agreed on this assessment, and noticing that the main party had passed by, set off without further ado. Picking themselves up, the two adventurers talked about their close call. "That must have been the Imperial Gate commander on patrol," said Michiori. I nearly died when I thought they were actually going to arrest us for being suspicious characters, said Tachiwaki. It was quite funny, though, when they called us white-legged robbers, laughed Michiori. But what a shame, he continued. We'll have to turn back. We're covered in shit. If I go to her stinking like this, she won't let me get near her. Tachiwaki laughed heartily. My lord, for you to have come through this heavy rain and suffered what you have to get to her, your lady will be so impressed with your devotion, it will be as though you are drenched in musk perfume. My lord's residence is far. Our destination is very near. Let's carry on. When Tachiwaki spoke thus, Michiori felt his resolve strengthened. Anyway, it would be a waste to give up now, he thought, and so they forged on. Okay.
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to read a poem by Wago Ryoichi, and this is going to be in the forthcoming Monkey. I don't want to introduce the poem so much first because I kind of want it to speak for itself, but I will just say a little bit about Wago first. So he's a poet and a Japanese literature teacher from Fukushima, and he was actually in Fukushima during the disaster and refused to leave. And he actually gained a following on Twitter because during this disaster, he continued to post short poems, just kind of with his reactions to what was happening. And basically, this led to him being dubbed a kind of frontline poet, like a poet on the front lines. Eventually, these tweets were collected in a book called Pebbles of Poetry, Shino Subute. He also has a English collection out. It was published in 2023 by Vagabond Press, translated by Ayako Takahashi and Judy Halevsky. So what I'm going to read the poem first, and then I'll talk a little bit afterwards. It's quite a pacey poem. I probably won't take very long, but I'll just take a deep breath before I start. Okay, so I approach a vast prison in a desolate place, animosity growing step by step as the landscape stifles its pregnant laughter. In the thriving hellscape of a greening grove, the coming night pecks a new chick blind. But how could you know, on this unseen road beneath a blackened sky? Who might forgive, with the charity left in the depths of the universe, the forgotten laundry I have become? And even you, concerned only with the clipping of your nails, at least look up along your way at the developing home. Self-sin and shadow eventually settle down, behind bars like the ribs of a demented whale. In cells of sweat-drenched consciousness, they kneel as joyful prisoners and gulp saliva into their hearts. Concocting notions of familial bliss, they pass a crowd of ambling seats to congregate around a table bereft of chairs and chuckle as human pillars drop their chopsticks. Click your tongue to the rhythm of defeated souls and, bike chain coming loose, call out to someone within the darkened houses at which you glare. Or maybe to the dozing plum tree, shedding tears beside a vacant window. The paper mill on the corner works silently through the night, hoping not to stir from sleep that child who brought home the whole schoolyard in their backpack. A family of telephone poles totters down the street, trying to match the rhythm of hexapod rhino beetles, whose soul horns now converge, greedy for blood's sweet nectar. A young fireman loses his memories in the flames of a Middle Eastern oil field that continues to burn with the intensity of our love. And the unique print of his middle finger quivers as if coerced into some unsightly dance. What can we do about that shingles infection of yours? And why, despite it all, do you linger in this airless room, mind lost to the masochism of an insomniac's dreams, giggling behind the curtains as oxygenated shadows dance in windows kissed by streetlight? When the night comes, I approach a vast prison in a desolate place. Step by step, something filling my rainbow spleen. As leaden clouds tumble overhead, without so much as a smile for the stars. Until a moment ago, I was transfixed by my finger's shadow. Flexing the digit over the kitchen table, I thought of neighboring shrubs, bullied into motion by the dislocated wind. Leaving behind my unsightly hand, the black cocoon within me fills with an existential truth, long abandoned to the darkness. And the lone fishing boat, with its dim light flickering away, loses yet another harbor. As a bleak dream washes over my wretched skin, I accept the shell I am. I love myself. I fear myself. I accept my skin. I reject my skin. When the night comes, I approach a vast prison in a desolate place. When the night comes, I am lost and shed my skin. I become a moth. With the wings of an angel upon my back and pearly white antennae atop my head. I become a moth with awkward compound eyes and the aimless thoughts of my innermost grove. I'm in a hurry. When the night comes, I will dash towards a vast prison in a desolate place. I am caught, and close my eyes to night's loving caress as I am cast into the darkness, with only the scales on my fingertips still dazzling with the light. But the rash on the back of my hand is a thing of sheer loneliness. That's why, when the night comes, I approach a vast prison in a desolate place. The road winds on without people or cars, but of course it's midnight. Why would anyone be here? So maybe you can see why I wanted the poem to speak for itself a little bit. It's quite a powerful poem, and it has a real sense of rhythm as well. That was one of the shorter readings. So Meg asked me maybe to talk a little bit about the difficulties of translating the poem. And I remember when Motoyuki Shibata-san is one of the editors at Monkey, when he suggested that I translate this poem, the first thing he said was, I have this poem, it's very difficult. Would you like to look at it? And so, yeah, I was filled with enthusiasm. But it is a difficult poem. I would say one of the, I mean, it's surrealist. Obviously, you probably got that from the reading. There's a real unnerving sense in the poem, but what is interesting is that it feels, I would describe, it has a broken nature. It kind of constantly feels like a sense of repeated breaking. And obviously, this is part of the ecological setting that Wago is writing from, this sense of maybe contamination and danger within the environment. But in his poem, yeah, it really comes out as it's really difficult sometimes to know if a line corresponds to another line. There are occasions when he will stop halfway through a thought and then continue with another thought. In terms of translation and kind of making the tough decisions, I mean, sometimes Wago as well, he also will literally split a kanji down the middle and drop it onto the next line. I guess I could have potentially also done that with the English and split a word down the middle. I chose not to do that. I thought it just didn't quite work. One of the words, for example, is rinpun, which is the kind of powdery scales that moths have. And so he split this into two, but that's okay in a way in Japanese because you have uroko, you have the scales, and then you also have fun, the kind of powder as well. I just didn't think it quite worked in English to just literally split scales. It just didn't have the same sense. So what I tried to do instead was just maintain the sense of a kind of momentum that is also broken. Like it's trying to start, but it keeps breaking apart, and then it tries to start again, it keeps breaking apart again. Yeah, so that was really what I tried to do with the poem and the translation. I'm not sure I really have much else to say, but obviously anyone with any questions can ask those during the Q&A. But yeah, thank you for listening.
So I'm going to read something from the Monkey that is available now. We've just finished the next issue, which will be issue number 7, which will come out in September, October. It is a short story by um, Kawakami Hiromi, who I've been translating now for a while. And she publishes in the Japanese monkey. We haven't talked about the relationship between the Japanese monkey and the English monkey. The English monkey. Initially, they were the Japanese monkey business and the English monkey business. Most of the Japanese monkey is translations into Japanese, many by Motoyuki Shibata. But he also includes a number of works by Japanese writers, contemporary Japanese writers. And Hiromi Kawakami has been publishing these very short stories called People from My Neighborhood in English. And I'll just read you one of those and you'll have a sense of what they are. It's called Old Home. It was, it was just this fall when the dog school principal began grumbling about wanting to return to his native place. At first, his dogs were his only audience, but eventually his complaints began to leak out when he was having a drink at the Love, for example, or even when he was walking down the street by himself. How I miss my old home, he lamented over and over until finally things reached the point where he had to tell his family. I need to go back home, he pleaded. But you grew up right here. His wife, who was a lawyer, tried to reason with him. Still, the dog school principal remained unconvinced. No, you're wrong, he corrected her. I come from a tiny hamlet at the foot of a mountain many miles from here. But your parents grew up in our neighborhood too, chimed in his daughters, both of whom worked in banks. How could your home be anywhere else? They pulled out a family album and showed him a photograph taken of him and his parents in front of the town hall, but he remained unshakable. One day, the dog school principal decided to go out in search of his true home. Taking care not to let his family see, he gathered his things, stuffed them in a backpack, took 2 slices of bread from the kitchen, slathered the bread with mayonnaise, inserted 3 slices of cheese and 4 slices of ham, and wrapped it up. After a moment's hesitation, he pulled a Coke from the fridge and stuck it in the backpack as well. He tiptoed to the door, quietly unlatched it, and set off on his quest. He had no idea how far he would have to travel. Early afternoon found him in a forest many miles from our neighborhood. A big fir tree stood at the entrance to the forest, so he set down his bag and devoured the sandwich. And then he twisted off the cap on the bottle of Coke and drank about half of that too. Even then, he was still thirsty, so he gulped some water from his canteen. The forest was deep. Nevertheless, he was able to drink from its streams, pluck its edible wild plants and herbs, and fell birds with his slingshot. The dog school principal had a knack with slingshots. Although he walked all day, he didn't reach the far side of the forest, so he decided to sleep outdoors. He gathered branches and twigs, made a fire, and then set about cleaning the birds he had killed. After gutting them and plucking their feathers, he made a stew from the meat, adding the plants and herbs he had picked. In the midst of these careful preparations, an image of life in his old home suddenly flashed before his eyes. His true parents were there. The father who set out each morning to gather firewood on the mountain. The mother who went to the river to wash clothes. A large peach came floating down the river one day, so his mother fished it out. And when she and her husband split it open, the dog school principal's much younger brother emerged. The brother never took to school and ultimately became a shut-in, according to the letter the dog school principal thought he might have received from his parents at some point in the past. After traveling for a number of days, the dog school principal finally arrived at his true home. A number of houses with thatched roofs dotted the landscape, but most seemed to have been abandoned. His chest tightened when he reached his family's house, for he could sense that people were inside. Making up his mind, he slid open the door to find a group of old folks gathered there. All were tiny, a mere third of his size. It struck him that there might be an equal number of men and women, but then again, they could have all been men, or for that matter, all women. It was hard to tell. The old folks were sitting around the sunken hearth, happily chatting away. Some were wearing straw sandals, while others stirred the big pot suspended over the fire. "Excuse me," the dog school principal said, whereupon all heads turned to him. "I'm looking for my parents, my little brother, too." The old folks looked at each other for a moment, and then they shrugged their shoulders as one. "And who might you be?" one of them said. "I am the eldest son. This is my home." They looked at each other and shrugged again, and then they went back to their conversation, never giving him a second glance. He walked alone through the house. A family of badgers had moved into his brother's room, while his parents' bedroom was filled with stuffed animals, an antelope, a wild boar, birds, and the like. When he returned to the hearth, one of the old people sitting there tugged at his sleeve. "We're very happy you've come at last," he or possibly she said. This then was his true home after all. He was so overcome with relief he nearly collapsed. But there was more. "We're in great need of caregivers, you see," the old one continued. "Thank goodness you showed up." Moments later, the dog school principal finally remembered. He had no true home or anything of the sort. He wasn't looking forward to returning to the house where his insufferable wife and daughters were waiting, but he lacked a caregiver's license, which meant staying was out of the question. He had no alternative but to say goodbye, and they crowded together in front of the house to see him off. Leaving his old home behind him, he bid them farewell with a smile on his lips. His eyes, however, weren't smiling.
I'd like to talk about just generally about how hot Japanese fiction is right now, or Japanese literature and translation, and also how hot, how excited people are about literature and translation, not just from Japanese, but there's been a real breakthrough, and we are benefiting from that. And Monkey is part of this trend, of course. We're riding on the wave, but it does seem to be growing and growing. In the past, there were waves of interest in Japanese literature, and then they would fade, right? Yes. But this is just building and building. So I think we're going to go back to our beginnings, and Ted is going to speak a little bit about Monkey Business, about the very beginnings of what we're doing.
Okay. Yeah. So it's 15 years now. I was in Tokyo, and through a set of circumstances, I was living with Motoyuki and his wife in their house, and was there for several months. And so we used to walk. I was teaching at Tokyo University at the time as a visiting professor, and I enjoyed working on the Oxford book, but I wanted to do more. The Oxford book ended with Yoshimoto Banana, who now is no longer a young writer as she was when I put that book together. And I've been reading Moto's the magazine he was editing, which was called Monkey Business, and I was having a lot of fun doing that. And so we kept talking. We talked about a number of times about what projects might be possible. And one day I just said, "Hey, Moto, why don't we translate stories from Monkey Business and do that in English and start out that way?" And he was reluctant at first, but then it kind of caught on. The idea caught on in both of our minds. So we started doing this project. So this would have been I think 2009 or 2010. And in the first issue, now the problem at the time was that everybody was reading Murakami, right? If you said Japanese literature, they thought, oh, Murakami, right?
Still
And
true, still true.
and it didn't go any farther than that, right? In their minds, you know, he was like Mount Fuji and everything else was lowlands, right? They didn't know that there was so much variety and so much quality literature in taking place in Japan, because in literary terms, Japan was booming, even though in economic terms it wasn't. So, so in the first issue, which was 160 pages long, about 70 pages of it was an interview with Murakami. and because we knew, you know, that if we want to get readers, if we want people to be drawn to our new magazine, Murakami is the best way to do it. And now we didn't have a lot of translators at the time in our immediate circle, but Michael Emmerich, who's a brilliant translator of the younger generation, and then Jay Rubin, who is a brilliant translator of the older generation, including me, they pitched in. And in fact, they have been with us every single issue. So we've done now 14 issues, and they've been there. There's no issue in which Jay Rubin or Michael Emmerich is not present. So in the Japanese monkey business at the beginning, Kawakami Hiromi was, you know, publishing these stories, one every issue. Now the Japanese monkey business came about 3 times a year. The English only comes out once a year. So I translated in the English version, I translated these short stories, People from My Neighborhood, and I've been doing it ever since. We published one book with Granta, and there'll be another one, I guess, because they just keep building up. She's still doing it. She loves doing it. I love translating them. I've talked to her about it. And it's like, I don't know if any of you have read Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson, but it's, you know, like a collection of short stories, but they're all linked because they're about people who live in this town, Winesburg. So this is kind of like what she's doing is kind of like Winesburg, Ohio on acid. You know, it's really kooky. And like you could see with the dog school principal, I mean, just the idea of a dog school principal in itself, right? It should tell you something. And so this story that I read is probably maybe the 45th, somewhere in there, that many stories like that I've been translating. So every time I get a new monkey in the mail in Japanese, first thing I do is turn to the Kawakami Hiromi story because I love it. And she loves writing them too. It's like revisiting old friends. Like I've known the dog school principal now for 15 years. So then as time passed, monkey business kind of picked up steam, and then we lost our funder. We had one funder, and then luckily we were able. Moto was able to come up with, you know, Uniqlo, the clothing Uniqlo. They're doing pretty well, right? And and the old man, the guy who founded Uniqlo, was our first angel from that. And then after 2 or 3 years, he said, okay, so I've been supporting you guys now for a couple of years. When are you going to start making money? And we had to tell him, you know, there ain't no business in monkey business, right? And so he turned it over to his son. They didn't cut us loose, right? They were so kind that way. And so he turned us over to his son, Koji Yanai. And now Koji Yanai is with Moto, you know, working closely together. And they have different projects, but monkey is still the main thing. And thanks to them, we're able to tour, publish, reward, you know, I mean, obviously nobody makes a lot of money doing translations. We could talk about that later, but ain't no money, ain't no business in translation either. But you know, the circle around us has grown and grown. Later, we'll talk about how the translation process works, how recruitment takes place, how the editing process takes place. And now, in the first issue, I translated 3/4 of the issue. Now it's not necessary or not advisable because we have so many great translators working with us. And we're so happy to be part of this growing operation. And yeah, so is there anything else? Yeah, what?
I just would like to make a comment. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm in pre-modern literature, as you can tell. But when Meg started sending me the issues of Monkey, and I wasn't drawn to modern Japanese literature. I don't know why I'm drawn to the past. It's a kind of mysterious thing. But Monkey sort of shifted things for me. And it's not that I didn't have favorite modern authors of the classical kind, but I wanted to bring up one of the things that makes the new Monkey so special is the visual element of it. And I see that as going back to even Tokugawa literature, to Yomihon and these things, where you couldn't conceive of a popular book in the Edo period without having illustrations. And this has been brought into this age as it's happening right now in such a wonderful way, because the illustrations are incredible. How they work with the story. So how did that come about?
The Japanese Monkey is the same trim size. It also has a lot of illustrations. It is different in that it's much more tightly themed. And generally, they'll use one illustrator throughout. We don't do that. We use a variety of illustrations and images, and we draw on art from different periods as well. So and stock photos. We have to work with a budget. So yes, but that concept came from the Japanese Monkey, but then Gilbert has very much built on that and created something that is different. We are publishing books now, and there is some business in publishing books, and we just have we have an imprint. It's called the Monkey Imprint, fiction imprint with Stonebridge Press in San Francisco. And we have 4 books out so far and 2 more in the pipeline. So yeah, we're expanding in that way.
This event today, I guess, constitutes a monkey event, right? And we've had about 50 of these monkey events over the years.
Yes.
All over the world. We went to Singapore. We've done them, of course, in Japan. We did it in England. So there is a kind of a traveling show aspect to what we do, and this spread of translation and translated literature and interest in those things is visible wherever we go.
Yeah.
It's not just here. Or I do think, though, if I can put in a plug for Canada and translation in Canada, I do think that, from my experience at least, translation is especially robust and kind of confident in Canada. I think maybe it's because we start with 2 languages. Yes. And so we have translation as part of our everyday lives, and part of our politics and our society. It's also because of the number of immigrants who've come here. Since I arrived in Toronto in 1970 from New York, my wife Tam came at the same time from Hong Kong. And, we've seen the city change and we've seen the country change. And so the growth of translation, I think, is reflective of that kind of evolution. People are interested in each other's food, for example. Toronto is a great place to eat because there's so many different ethnic foods. But when you go into a restaurant, you see the mixture of people who are eating them. Teaching at York, I knew my students were friends, across the lines of ethnicity, and eating in each other's homes, or going out and eating in the various places in the city where you can find very good Chinese food, or very good Indian food, or what have you. So I think this whole thing, it's part of a kind of cultural growth and an extension of connections between people who are eating internationally, reading internationally, and dating internationally too.
That made me, your remark just made me think of the monkey issue that was on food. And I think one of the things that sets monkey aside is that there's always a themed part. So you have one about food, and then you have a number of stories that relate to it very loosely. And I wonder, where did that come from? Because that kind of sets it aside as a literary journal too. The visuals and this theme, choosing a theme for each issue.
Again, we were learning from the Japanese monkey. There's always a theme, even tighter theme with the Japanese monkey. So why don't we speak a little bit about the present state of Japanese literature and translation? That is on my list here. So the expansion in the number of translators, I mean, we're very much dedicated, part of our mission to mentor, not only to mentor up and coming translators, but also to support the established translators, to create a community that every year is growing. I mean, Chris, you joined us, 2 years ago, right?
I think a little more. Actually,
Three
I've
years.
contributed to the last 5 monkeys. So
Oh, I'm so embarrassed.
I'm quite anonymous, so yeah, it's fine.
No, you're not. So, our most recent one is Leo Elizabeth Takada, and that was when she worked on Perfect Days with Wim Wenders and got to know Moto, who has a small part in that. And then Moto was interested in what she was doing. She had translated the script. Yes.
I mean, I don't want to take too much credit for this, or us collectively to take too much credit for this, but many of the Japanese authors who were first translated in monkey business and then monkey have become big names.
Yes.
Like Kawakami Mieko.
And many of them appeared first or when they were relatively unknown with monkey.
And Shibasaki Tomoka. And it's reflective too of the fact that, when I started out learning Japanese and starting reading in Japanese, go to a Japanese bookstore, there'd be one wall which was Jōryu Bungaku, and the rest of the Jōryu Bungaku, meaning women's literature.
Yeah.
And the rest of the bookstore would be primarily male. It's almost reversed now.
Yeah.
There is so much good writing coming out from women authors, and the idea of there being a wall set aside for women
is passé, right?
Is quite absurd.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things we've been benefiting from and connected to, and other authors as well. Furukawa Hideo is another writer who we've promoted and who now is being read around the world.
And we're doing a new book, one of our monkey imprint books. The upcoming one is by him, by Furukawa Hideo.
So we're not just benefiting from the growth of Japanese literature translation, we're creating it too. Patting myself on the back.
But it's true. I don't know if you've noticed, Sisters in Yellow or any of these. The Miyako Kawakami is just huge now. So, yeah. Oh, Chris.
So it's interesting what you were saying there. So a lot of people, when you talk to them in the translation industry or perhaps in the publication of translation, often credit the popularity of convenience store women, so konbini ningen, with kind of almost giving rocket fuel to the female Japanese literature. Do you think that's kind of reductive then? Do you think there was already a wave of Japanese female literature being translated and published?
Yeah, when I did the Oxford book, there are 36 stories in there, ranging from Moriogai to Yoshimoto Banana. In the early section of the book, it has to be done chronologically because all the Oxford books are like that. But I had a hard time. I wanted to include more women writers, but I had a hard time finding them. Of course, there's Higuchi Ichio, which everybody loves, and who was writing around the turn of the century. But of the 20th century. But then as you come into, we were just talking about Hayashi Fumiko today and proletarian literature and how proletarian literature is a movement. One of its lasting contributions was making it possible for Japanese women to have a voice and to speak out, and not just elite, but working class women too. So that is in the, part of the growth. Oba Minako and Enchi Fumiko, and there are a lot of famous and very successful women writers. But in terms of, I think part of it's economics, that women are, men feel the need to be or have the need to be the provider. And it's very hard to make a living on literature, to say it the least. And so women have had more, perhaps, opportunities for agency that way. But at this point, I mean, you'd have to say that the momentum really is on the side of women's literature. They have more to write about, perhaps. So I don't know, what was your question?
Oh, you were talking about convenience store women.
Yeah, I was just wondering, because you were talking about monolithic authors recently, and this idea that there were just a core kind of canon of Japanese authors in translation. So I was wondering if it was a reductive view that Konbini Ningen, Convenience Store Woman, just almost rose up on its own and then brought up with it lots of other Japanese female authors into translation.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, okay.
I think it's part of this larger trend. Yeah. I wouldn't say that it magically rose and pulled us all up with it, but
yeah, I'm talking about the industry. The thing that really strikes me, there is a website called Read Japanese Literature, which I would recommend to anyone. It's run by Alison Fincher, and she puts all the kind of newest releases and upcoming releases on there. And there are so many books coming out now by Japanese authors that are cozy, what they call cozy fiction. Yeah, and often kind of involving cafes, libraries, cats. Yeah, I was going to finish with cats because the big one is cats. But that is definitely something that it feels like a modern trend. I don't think that was really there before. And even in the transition period when Murata and other authors were kind of talking about feminist issues, even arguably existential issues, now there is a shift almost to the kind of comfort food of fiction.
I think we need to distinguish between literary fiction. We don't want to talk about this very, very often, but it's true. And the genre fiction, and they're wonderful and they're entertaining. You know, the cozies with the bookshop and the cat, and crime novels and thrillers, and there are many male writers in those writing genre fiction and doing quite well.
Right now, we're brainstorming about what the next issue is going to be.
Yeah, maybe during the Q&A we'll throw some ideas out.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. That's when Moto and Meg and I are able to really brainstorm and say we could do this or we could do that. And right now we're leaning towards
the classics.
The classics.
Because we're trying to catch the zeitgeist, and look at the Odyssey. I don't know if you noticed that recent article by A.O. Scott in the Times about the 4 big translations of the Odyssey and comparing them. And, we can do that with Genji. Why not? This interest in the classics is interesting. Why in the zeitgeist right now? What is this? So, yeah.
We should get to the Q&A very soon, but one of the reasons why I chose to translate the story that I'm translating now is actually because it's an example of genre fiction from 1,000 years ago. And that seemed interesting to me as a concept, given also that it's a very entertaining story. But with the maturity of the research into Japanese literature in North America particularly, and Europe, most translations of pre-modern literature now are directed, they're academic studies. In fact, there's a tendency for the author to write the book of theory about the work that they're translating and put the translation of the work on their website. So as though the translation itself is not important, it's what you have to say about it. And that also was part of my intention of when I publish this book, I want to publish it with a publisher who will spread it to. I'm writing it for a general public, not for fellow academics. And I think it just happened because of the maturity of the field, but it now. There isn't as much translation of classical literature out there as I think there should be. But, yeah.
I think, when I started working with Moto, he is the premier translator of American literature into Japanese. And so I absorbed a lot of his principles. The main one being that you want the experience of reading the translation to be as close as possible to the translation, to reading the original. And then anything that gets in the way of that, you want to try to find ways of getting around, or so that obviously, if you look at world literature, right, translation has always been the name of the game. It's just that the translator has always been, left off the front cover. And now that's changing, and more often you see the translator's name on the front cover. So that is, I think, very significant. But there's still a prejudice against translation. People see it as a second level, second tier. If you go to academic institutions, there are many which reject the idea of translation as having anything close to the value of quote unquote original scholarship. They don't see the value in it. That's changing, right? And it depends very much on which institution you're talking about. But that kind of difficulty, really, of the original versus the translation, and how you somehow evaluate either, that'll continue. I'm sure that'll continue. Just like, we all come out of a history of translation that starts with religious texts, translating the sutras or translating the Bible, you name it, right? So that kind of discourse is ancient.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with Ted. I think what he said is all right. With poetry, I think probably the worst thing in the world would be a literal translation of poetry. So it's something you have to navigate. I remember I read an article by Moto, I think with Japan Times, and he said that the translation should spark the same sort of joy that you felt when you read the original. And with a literal translation, that's just not going to happen. But yeah, academics are always, going on about domestication of the text and like exoticizing the text. So it is a difficult thing to navigate. But yeah, at the very least, I mean, we as English speakers and in English and Japanese, it achieves the similar goals by very different means. So what you have to do is this sounds very esoteric and pretentious, but you have to listen to the voice behind the actual writing. You have to think about what they're trying to say and kind of go from there rather than what they've actually said. So
yes, I just mentioned that one of the liberties I took with this, the translation of Ochibo Monogatari, is anonymous. So I didn't feel I was stepping on anybody's toes. I've translated the Heian women diarists. And with that, I felt an incredible responsibility to their voice. But with this one, it was the sort of loyalty to the story, to make the story live for another audience. And one of the problems, and it came up in the Kawakami story. So in Japanese, and it works in the English translation, you can refer to the dog school principal, and he never has another name. But in Heian fiction, the heroine, the sort of upper class heroine woman, is never given a name. And she's referred to by the lady, or when it's a man and woman together, when she and her lover are together, the narrator will call them man and woman, onna, otoko, instead of using the name. But as I was working on the translation, I couldn't get it to work I couldn't get a grasp of the character. And then from somewhere, the name Aya, I have no justification for it. You know, it came, and all of a sudden, it was as though she had flesh, and so it had to have a name. The heroine had to have a name in English, in a way that she didn't need it in the original Japanese. So, yeah, that's an example. I'm still kind of nervous about the liberty, but I have to just go with it.
We do have, with many of the contemporary writers, they have close relationships with the translators. And the writer often encourages the translator to leap, to give you a reading experience that will be equivalent to what they're doing in Japanese. So the writers are very much on side with that.
Yeah, I've done a lot of translating of Murakami. And the great thing about translating Murakami, among many, but one great thing is that he is a translator himself. And that means that and not only that, he's a translator who who's very creative in his translations. I've gone over a number of his translations. And you can tell it's a Murakami translation, actually, because there's a certain rhythm that he has naturally. But he wants his translators to be free, and of course he's being translated into over 50 languages. So they have to have an office just keeping track of all of this stuff, right? All the permissions and translators agreements and so forth. And so he can't obviously oversee everything, but he translates English, so he can read my translations, unlike most writers, in great detail. And he's never said, I don't like the way you did that. I think you could change that. One time I was translating something he was writing about his own youthful experience, and he said, I was writing about his landlord, and he said the landlord wasn't really going to renovate. He just wanted to kick us out. So, so that gave me the background. I couldn't say that in the translation, but that gave me the background to do a more accurate job.
I guess that's and it's just reading and reading and reading, and imagining, and reading, and the sort of the historical. But for the pre-modern works, it's that kind of immersion in the historical knowledge, of both from historical side and also from reading the fiction or whatever's in translation. So it starts that way, just a lot of reading.
Yeah, I just want to talk about the preamble you had as well, about the people assuming that it's just a literal translate. If you have the both languages, then you can be a translator. I feel like as technology improves, I mean, AI is a huge thing in not just translation, but literature in general. But as that improves, it's going to be even more important that it's not just about knowing both languages, but also the writing ability, like having an ability to give voice to that original. So yeah, obviously it's a fallacy to assume that, but I think it is as sometimes more important to be a good writer as a translator. So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that. It's a tough. It's easy to kind of get all doom and gloom about AI, and definitely translators are worried not just about the replacement of the creative part, but that the work that they do for publishers is kind of without the permission, or sometimes it's an obligation clause, that the things that they translate are actually being used to train AI. So they're unwillingly participating in making themselves obsolete, which it's not ideal. Yeah, it's a really tough question, and I don't really know in terms of what the future will look like. I think publishers, given an easy option and a cheaper option, will definitely take an easier and cheaper option. So yeah, it's, I mean, very literary translation, the kind of stuff we translate at Monkey, the more experimental stuff. I think it's probably a ways off yet, being able to tackle those things, but I could also be completely wrong. So
I'm not sure the personality of the translator has much relevance. When you're translating, you're working with text, you're trying to revoice the text in your language as you read. And I worked with, when I was working on Murakami a few years ago, his stuff is big business, right? So the publisher is requiring or demanding a quick turnaround because they need to get money in to balance their books. So they had me and a guy named Phil Gabriel. He and I have never met, but we became friends online because we were translating the same works. In one case, we were translating a 500-page novel. He did the first 250 pages, and I did the second 250 pages. So we're working parallel, right? And then the editor was trying to. It was her responsibility to make sure that there wasn't a huge change in the translation, that it flowed smoothly from part one to part two. It wasn't a problem. It wasn't a problem because we're working with the text, and we both have some awareness, some experience with Murakami, and it flowed his half flowed into my half, and it wasn't a problem. We did that with another book too, two other books. So working with side by side with another translator on the same work, you would expect, because he's very different than me. He's a born again Christian, and I'm the opposite, if there can be such a. but he's a he's a good translator, and he and I, we're communicating online. It's just your prose, you know what you're doing, you have a voice. Murakami's voice is very distinctive, but the way we hear that voice is obviously very similar. So I don't think personality comes into it.
I'll just start off because I think my answer will be quite short. But I don't know if it's a process. I don't know if calling it process is probably giving it too much credit. But what I do is I write something and then I immediately put it out of my mind forever. So I kind of like to move on from the thing I've written. Obviously, that doesn't include the editing process. I'm there for the editing process. So actually, with this, it was kind of like coming back to an estranged friend. So yeah, that's kind of my part. So I guess I can't give a good answer to that.
Yes, responding to wanting to improve. Meg has been helping me as an editor, and occasionally her suggestions, just seeing the English, has had me maybe take out some redundancies that were in the original. So yes, it is something that happens. Yeah.
Especially when you read it out loud. When you read it out loud, you see something, you see a little awkward phrase.
Yeah, I should have. I would never consider a poetry translation finished until I'd read it out loud quite a few times. I feel like that's an obligation, definitely. Yeah, for prose too. Yeah. I think what probably happens is that because the industry is struggling as a whole, they shift more and more towards what will sell. So they're the kind of guaranteed things. So the doom and gloom probably manifests as authors that would have maybe been picked up in the past, like they're kind of like mid-rate, that like the publisher isn't sure, but they think, okay, I'll take a chance. They're just not willing to take those chances anymore. But something like a cozy book or something by an established author, they will quite happily gravitate towards that. But obviously Monkey is not that.
And there are new publishers popping up all over, and smaller ones that are relatively maybe not established in the last few years, like Pushkin Press is one I can think of, Europa Editions. I mean, they are becoming very they're doing well with translated literature, and they're finding ways to publish it and make it work.
Thank you again very much for the very insightful discussion. We really appreciate Sonia, Chris, Meg, and Ted for traveling all this way to be here today and for sharing your insights and experiences with us.